The clatter of a silver water pitcher hitting an Italian marble floor is startling, but the silence that descended in its wake inside the Airy, Chicago's most coveted rooftop restaurant, was a living entity, thick and suffocating. 60 of the city's most powerful figures, men and women who carved up the Midwest's economy for sport, held their breath in unison. Alistair Finch, a man whose net worth fluctuated with the stock market but never dipped below $10 billion, a titan of the tech industry who had built his empire from a garage and a dream, had just bellowed in the face of a 22-year-old waitress. Every person in that room, draped in couture and dripping with diamonds, expected her to shatter like fine crystal. They expected tears, a panicked apology, a hasty retreat. Instead, Clara Hayes straightened her spine. She placed the silver tray she was holding onto a nearby service stand with a deliberate, quiet click. Then she turned, walked back to the table, leaned forward until her face was inches from the billionaire's, and spoke 5 words that would detonate a bomb in the heart of the city's corporate landscape. "Raise your voice again, and this is over." What Alistair Finch did next wasn't just shocking. It was tectonic. You will not believe how this night, a night that began with spilled water, would end with the birth of an empire and the fall of a king. The Chicago wind howled a mournful song around the panoramic windows of the Airy that Thursday evening. Below, the city lights glittered like a fallen constellation, a universe away from the aching reality of Clara's life. Her feet, squeezed into regulation black flats, were a symphony of pain. It was the end of her 3rd double shift of the week, and her mother's next round of chemotherapy was scheduled for Tuesday. The bill for the last one was sitting on her kitchen table, a stark white threat. She was bone-weary, but her expression was a carefully constructed mask of serene professionalism. "Table 7 needs their check, and be sharp about it," whispered Marco, the maitre d', a man whose anxiety was as starched as his collar. "Mr. Finch is volatile tonight." Clara didn't need the heads-up. Even people who lived under a rock knew of Alistair Finch. At 34, he was the visionary CEO of Helios Dynamics, a company that had revolutionized renewable energy. He was brilliant, driven, and notoriously impatient. He was handsome in a way that was more intimidating than charming. Sharp cheekbones, intense blue eyes that seemed to analyze and dismiss everything in a single glance, and a perpetual tension in his jaw. Tonight, however, he looked less like a visionary and more like a thundercloud about to burst. He was dining with Richard Sterling, a man who represented everything Alistair was not. Sterling was old money, his fortune inherited, and his position cemented by generations of backroom deals. He was heavier, with a florid complexion and a patronizing smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "The acquisition is a fool's errand, Alistair," Sterling was saying, his voice a condescending drawl as he swirled a glass of obscenely expensive scotch. "You're a tech boy. You don't understand heavy industry. Sterling Manufacturing has legacy contracts, union issues. It's a quagmire." "I understand that it's underperforming by 40% because of antiquated leadership," Alistair retorted, his voice tight. The silverware on the table seemed to vibrate with his contained anger. "Don't lecture me on legacy, Richard. I know your profit margins. You're bleeding cash and hiding it behind creative accounting. I'm trying to prevent you from torching $1 billion of your own money," Sterling said with a smug chuckle. Clara approached the table, her movements fluid and practiced. "Mr. Finch, your Evian, sir." She held the tall glass bottle, condensation beading on its surface. She had performed this simple task 10,000 times. But as she began to pour, Sterling, with a theatrical gesture of dismissal, waved his hand. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Alistair, you and your ridiculous water preferences. A man should drink scotch." The comment was aimed at Alistair, but it was Clara's arm that Sterling's fleshy hand brushed against. It wasn't a hard impact, but it was unexpected. The neck of the bottle tipped, and a small stream of cold water, no more than an ounce, splashed onto a stack of documents sitting beside Alistair's plate. The explosion was immediate and terrifying. Alistair shot to his feet, the chair scraping back with a screech that cut through the restaurant's ambient hum. "Are you blind?" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. The sound ricocheted off the glass walls. Clara instinctively took a step back, her hand still clutching the bottle. "Sir, Mr. Sterling. Look at this." Alistair's face was a mask of fury. This wasn't about the water. It was the culmination of a frustrating negotiation, of Sterling's condescension, of the weight of his empire. Clara was simply the lightning rod. "These are signed NDAs. Do you have any idea what you've done? Are you completely incompetent?" The area fell into a deathly hush. A state senator at table 4 suddenly found his lobster fascinating. A socialite at table 9 stared, her mouth agape. Marco the maitre d' began to scurry over, his face the colour of ash. "Mr. Finch, my deepest apologies. She is one of our best. A momentary lapse." "I don't care if she's the Queen of England," Alistair barked, his piercing blue eyes finally locking on to Clara. He was a tall man, and he loomed over her, a figure of immense power and rage. "I am trying to close a deal that will reshape the energy sector in this country, and I have to contend with a clumsy waitress who can't even pour water." Sterling let out a low, satisfied laugh. Temper, Alistair. If you can't manage the staff, how can you possibly manage my company?" That laugh, that single, mocking sound, was the spark that lit the fuse. Something inside Clara, something forged in the fires of her father's long illness and her mother's quiet strength, refused to break. It wasn't the insult, it wasn't the shouting, it was the dismissive arrogance. It was the unwritten rule of this world that her humanity was worth less than a piece of paper. She thought of her father, a history professor who had taught her about strategy, about how small, well-placed forces could topple empires. He had been broken not by a disease, but by the endless, dehumanizing bureaucracy of insurance companies run by men just like these. Clara didn't cry. She did not apologize again. She moved. She placed the water bottle on the table with a firm, definitive thud. In the profound silence, it sounded like a judge's gavel. She looked up, her clear hazel eyes meeting Alistair Finch's raging blue ones. There was no fear in her gaze, only a cold, analytical calm. "I did not spill the water, Mr. Finch," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "Mr. Sterling created a diversion to disrupt your focus, and you took the bait. You hit my arm because you have a momentary lapse in emotional control," Marco gasped audibly. "Clara, that's enough. Leave now." She ignored him, her eyes still locked on Alistair. "You are negotiating for Sterling Manufacturing. You are frustrated because Mr. Sterling is not engaging with your data. He is attacking your ego, treating you like a child. It's a classic pincer movement, sir. He's flanking you psychologically while holding his ground on the financials, and you are letting him win." Alistair was stunned into silence. His mouth was slightly agape. No one spoke to him this way. Not his board, not his rivals, and certainly not a 22-year-old in a black apron. Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that only the two men could hear. "Raise your voice again, and this is over." Alistair blinked. "Excuse me?" "This negotiation," Clara clarified, her gaze unwavering. "I walk away. Marco calls security. You cause a scene over a damp piece of paper. Mr. Sterling goes back to his board and tells them that the great Alistair Finch is so unstable he can't handle a minor disruption. He'll paint you as erratic, a poor investment risk. How does that affect your stock price when the markets open tomorrow? The silence at the table stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. Sterling's smug expression had evaporated, replaced by a look of disbelief and fury. He looked at Alistair, expecting another eruption. But Alistair wasn't looking at Sterling. He was staring at Clara. He saw the cheap, worn-down flats, the simple, pulled-back ponytail, and the exhausted eyes that held a fire he hadn't encountered in a boardroom in a decade. He saw something beyond her uniform. He saw a strategist. Slowly, the angry flush receded from Alistair's face. He glanced at the damp papers, then back at Clara. A strange, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Sit down," he said. Clara's brow furrowed. "Sir?" Alistair gestured to the empty fourth chair at the table. "I said, sit down." His voice was calm now, laced with a new, dangerous curiosity. He looked at Marco, who was hovering nearby, looking like he might faint. "Bring her a glass, and the file." "Mr. Finch, the file," Marco stammered. "The strategic analysis file, the one you were told to hold. Bring it." "Now," Alistair commanded. He turned his full attention back to Clara. "You believe I'm losing." "You're not losing," Clara said, remaining on her feet. "You're fighting on the wrong battlefield." "Prove it," Alistair challenged. "Sit down. Explain the battlefield to me. If you can give me one piece of actionable advice that changes the dynamic of this negotiation, I will pay your mother's medical bills for the next year. In full. If you can't, you can find another job tomorrow." Clara's breath caught in her throat. A year of medical bills. That was freedom. That was peace of mind. That was life. She looked at Sterling, who was now sputtering with indignation. She looked at Alistair, whose blue eyes were now gleaming with an intensity that was no longer anger, but something far more potent. Clara Hayes pulled out the chair and sat down. "Deal," she said. The atmosphere at Table 7 transformed. It was no longer a public humiliation. It was a war council. Marco, his hands trembling, placed a heavy crystal tumbler of water in front of Clara, and, on Alistair's silent command, the thick, leather-bound file. He then retreated, as if fleeing a blast zone. "This is preposterous, Alistair," Richard Sterling fumed, adjusting his silk tie. "You're entertaining this girl's delusions? I will not be a party to this farce." "Sit down, Richard," Alistair said, his gaze fixed on Clara. "You were just complaining the evening was dull. Now it's not." He pushed the file toward her. "Sterling Manufacturing. Richard claims its strength is in its legacy. I claim its weakness is its inefficiency. You have 5 minutes. Find the real battlefield." Clara ignored the water. Her hands, calloused from carrying heavy trays, opened the file. The crisp, expensive paper felt alien to her touch. What Alistair and Sterling couldn't possibly know was that Clara Hayes wasn't just a waitress. She was a dropout from Columbia University's history department, where she had been the top student in a specialized program, the history of military strategy and logistics. Her father, before he got sick, had been obsessed with it. He hadn't taught her dates and names. He'd taught her Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and Napoleon. He'd taught her to see the world not as a series of events, but as a series of campaigns, of supply lines, of feints and fortifications. The cancer had taken her father and her tuition money, but it hadn't taken his lessons. Her eyes scanned the pages, not the numbers on the balance sheets, but the text, the footnotes, the appendices. She wasn't looking for financial fraud, she was looking for strategic weaknesses. The two men watched her in silence. After a minute, Sterling sneered. Perhaps she needs a dictionary. Clara looked up, her gaze bypassing Sterling, as if he were a piece of furniture. She addressed Alistair directly. "You're both wrong," she said, her voice confident. Alistair raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." "You're arguing about the castle," Clara said, tapping the financial summary. "Is it a fortress or a ruin? That's the wrong question." She flipped to a section deep in the file, a dry, boring report on supply chain logistics. "The question is, where does the castle get its food and water?" She pointed to a single paragraph. Sterling Manufacturing's entire North American distribution network relies on a single, exclusive contract with a freight company called Midwest Rail Transit. "It's the most efficient carrier in the region," Sterling interjected defensively. "A very favorable contract." "It's a fatal vulnerability," Clara countered, her voice hardening. "An army that relies on a single supply line is an army waiting to be starved." She slid a different page across the table, an SEC filing from another corporation. And Midwest Rail Transit was quietly acquired 3 months ago by a holding company. She tapped the name of the holding company, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Helios Dynamics. Alistair froze. Clara pressed her advantage. "You already own his supply line, Mr. Finch. You bought it months ago. He doesn't even know it. You're not here to negotiate the price of his castle. You're here to accept his unconditional surrender. The battlefield isn't in this file. It's in your pocket." The blood drained from Richard Sterling's face. He looked from the documents to Alistair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had been so focused on defending his company's internal value that he had completely missed the external threat that had already surrounded him. Alistair stared at Clara, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He had bought the rail company as a minor strategic investment, a footnote in his quarterly acquisitions, and had forgotten about it. He had missed the connection. But she hadn't. In 3 minutes, she had seen what his entire multi-million-dollar M&A team had overlooked. He looked at Sterling, the condescending rival who now looked like a trapped animal. "Richard," Alistair said, his voice now a purr of pure predatory satisfaction. "I believe the terms of our discussion have just changed. My initial offer is now off the table. The new offer is 50 cents on the dollar. Take it, or by Monday morning, your shipping costs will triple, and your company will be insolvent by Christmas." Sterling shot to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. His face was a mottled purple. He didn't look at Alistair. He glared at Clara, his eyes filled with a venom that was terrifying to behold. "You!" he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You have no idea the enemies you've just made, you little gutter rat." He turned and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving a trail of shockwaves in his wake. Alistair watched him go, then slowly turned his gaze back to Clara. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, withdrew a slim, elegant checkbook and a fountain pen. He wrote quickly, tore out the check, and pushed it across the table. Clara looked at it. The amount written was $250,000. "A signing bonus," Alistair said. Clara stared at the check. It was a number so large it seemed fictional. It would solve every problem she had. It was a miracle. She pushed it back toward him. "Our deal was for my mother's medical bills for 1 year," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "I'll send you the invoices." Alistair looked surprised. "Why wouldn't you take it?" "Because I didn't do it for the money," Clara said, standing up and smoothing down her apron. "I did it because I can't stand bullies. and Mr. Sterling is a bully." She began to turn away. "I should get back to my shift." "Wait," Alistair said, standing as well. He was taller than she'd realized, and for the first time, he didn't look angry or intimidating. He looked fascinated. "You're wasted here. A mind like yours, a mind that sees strategy in a logistics report. Why are you serving water?" "Life has its own campaigns," Clara said simply. "Come work for me," Alistair stated. It wasn't a question. Clara gave a short, humorless laugh. "Doing what? Pouring your Evian without spilling it?" "As my chief strategist," Alistair said. "I'll create the position. You'll report directly to me. You'll analyze every deal, every threat, every opportunity. I don't have anyone who thinks like you." The offer hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, and more. But she looked at the man who, less than an hour ago, had humiliated her in front of a room full of people. "I don't work for men who shout at the staff," she said quietly. "I won't shout at you again," Alistair promised, a genuine note of something that sounded like respect in his voice. "I have a feeling you're the only person in this city who isn't afraid to shout back." He placed his business card on the table next to the check she had rejected. "My office. Monday. 8 a.m. We'll discuss your salary. And Clara," he added, as she finally turned to leave, "don't bother with the invoices. My foundation is covering your mother's medical care. For life." Alistair Finch dropped a $1,000 bill on the table for a meal he hadn't eaten and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Clara standing by the table, the small black business card, looking like the key to a world she never knew existed. Clara didn't just show up on Monday. She arrived at 7:45 a.m., armed with a notebook and a quiet determination that felt like armor. The Helios Dynamics Tower was a shard of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the sky, a monument to Alistair Finch's ambition. The lobby was a cavern of white marble and hushed efficiency. When she announced herself to the executive assistant on the 80th floor, a woman named Evelyn, whose tailored suit probably cost more than Clara's rent for a year, she was met with a perfectly sculpted, skeptical eyebrow. "Clara Hayes, Mr. Finch's new chief strategist." Evelyn said the title as if it were a foreign word she found distasteful. "That's correct," Clara said, refusing to be intimidated. Evelyn's disdain was palpable, but a quick call confirmed the unbelievable. "He's waiting for you, through the double doors." Alistair's office was less an office and more a command center. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling window with a godlike view of Lake Michigan. The others were covered in seamless screens displaying stock tickers, satellite weather patterns, and streams of code. Alistair stood in the center of it all, not at his desk, but on a vast, empty expanse of floor, dictating to a disembodied AI voice. "And reallocate the R&D funds from the solar panel efficiency project to the battery storage division. I want a prototype with a 90% charge retention rate by Q4. End dictation." He turned as Clara entered. In the harsh morning light, he looked even more formidable. "You came," he said. "You made an offer I couldn't refuse," Clara replied, her voice even. "Good. Honesty and self-interest, the two most reliable forces in the universe." He gestured to a small, glass-walled office that adjoined his own. "That's yours. Your first task is on the tablet on the desk. I want a full strategic breakdown of the Sterling manufacturing acquisition. I don't want financials. My accountants can do that. I want a war plan. How to dismantle it, how to absorb its assets, how to neutralize its loyalist executives, and how to rebuild it into something stronger. I want it by Wednesday." It was an impossible task, a brutal sink-or-swim test designed to make her fail. "I'll need access to everything," Clara said. "Personnel files, internal communications, everything." Alistair nodded to Evelyn, who had materialized in the doorway. "Give her alpha-level clearance. She gets access to everything I do." Evelyn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Mr. Finch." For the next 2 days, Clara barely moved from that glass office. She consumed coffee and data in equal measure. She ignored the whispers and suspicious glances from the other executives. She didn't look at Sterling Manufacturing as a company. She looked at it as a conquered territory, filled with insurgents, hidden resources, and treacherous terrain. She cross-referenced employee loyalty reports with production numbers, mapped out social connections between managers, and read 20 years of company newsletters, looking for patterns of dissent and influence. Late Tuesday night, the entire floor was dark and silent, save for the hum of the servers and the glow from her office and Alistair's. He was still there, a silent, watchful presence. Clara was staring at a map of Sterling's largest factory, a sprawling complex south of the city. Something was wrong. The official output numbers didn't match the raw material intake and shipping manifests. There was a discrepancy, a black hole where millions of dollars in product simply vanished each quarter. She remembered her father, poring over maps of the Battle of Gettysburg, explaining how the outcome was decided not by the main clashes, but by a small, overlooked hill. "Always look for the terrain the enemy doesn't think is important, Clara," he had told her. She started digging into the factory's ancillary reports, waste management, environmental compliance, security logs. And then she found it, a series of payments disguised as environmental remediation costs to a shell corporation in Delaware. The payments were regular, substantial, and corresponded perfectly with the inventory shortfalls. But the shell corporation didn't remediate anything. Cross-referencing its address led her to a holding company owned by a name she recognized from the personnel files, the factory's head of security, a man with known ties to organized crime. Sterling wasn't just cooking the books. He was facilitating a massive, ongoing theft of his own company's products, letting a criminal syndicate bleed it dry in exchange for kickbacks to his personal offshore accounts. The union problems and inefficiencies weren't the disease. They were the symptoms Sterling used to hide the real cancer. Clara felt a jolt of adrenaline, cold and sharp. She grabbed her tablet and walked into Alistair's office without knocking. He was standing at the window, staring down at the city lights. "What is it?" he asked without turning. "I found the hill," Clara said, her voice breathless. She laid out the data, the connections, the irrefutable trail of theft and corruption that ran far deeper than simple mismanagement. Sterling wasn't running a company. He was running a crime scene. He was trying to sell it to you before the whole thing imploded. Alistair turned from the window. He reviewed her findings, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched. "This is more than a hostile takeover now," he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is a criminal case." He looked at her, and the distance he'd maintained for 2 days vanished. His blue eyes were blazing with a fierce, predatory light. "You didn't just give me a war plan, Clara. You gave me a kill shot." He stepped closer into her personal space. "Sterling is a cornered animal now. He's going to find out who uncovered this. He's going to come after you." "I can handle myself," Clara said, though a shiver of fear traced its way down her spine. "I know," Alistair said softly. "But you don't have to." He touched his earpiece. "Evelyn, activate the Praetorian Protocol for Ms. Hayes. Effective immediately." He looked back at Clara. "You'll have a security detail. 24/7. They'll be invisible, but they'll be there. Don't argue." Before she could protest, he did something unexpected. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin, and an electric current passed between them. "Go home, Clara. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we end this." But as Clara rode the elevator down, a sense of unease settled over her. She didn't know that Richard Sterling, a man with deep, dark roots in the city, had already been alerted. A loyalist inside Helios had told him about the girl with alpha-level clearance who was digging into the factory reports. Across the city, in a smoke-filled study that smelled of old leather and entitlement, Sterling put down his phone. He looked at two large, grim-faced men standing before him. "The girl from the restaurant. She's the one who found it," Sterling said, his voice a low growl. "I don't want her scared. I don't want her intimidated. I want her gone. Make it look like a tragic accident. A mugging in her bad neighborhood gone wrong." The intimidation that Alistair predicted started with a chilling subtlety that made Clara question her own sanity. A dead bird left on the doorstep of her small apartment. The feeling of being watched as she walked to the subway. Silent calls that hung up the moment she answered. She reported it to the discreet head of her new security detail, a former Secret Service agent named Graves, who assured her they were aware and monitoring the threats. The breaking point came a week after her discovery. She was returning home late, just after midnight, her mind buzzing with restructuring plans for Sterling Manufacturing. The streetlights on her block were out, plunging the street into an unnerving darkness. As she fumbled for her keys, a heavy van screeched to a halt beside her. Before she could scream, two men in black ski masks jumped out. Her training with Graves kicked in. She dropped her bag and ran, not toward her apartment, but toward the busier main street. But they were fast. One tackled her, his heavy body knocking the wind from her lungs. She fought back, kicking and scratching, landing a sharp elbow to his nose. He grunted in pain and anger, his grip tightening. "Stubborn little thing, aren't you?" he snarled, dragging her towards the van. Suddenly, the night erupted in a blur of motion. A black sedan, seemingly appearing from nowhere, mounted the curb, its headlights pinning the attackers. Two men, dressed in practical, dark tactical gear, emerged. It was Graves and another member of her detail. The fight was brutally efficient and shockingly fast. There were no flashy moves, just a series of precise, disabling strikes. Within 30 seconds, Clara's attackers were on the ground, incapacitated and groaning. Graves helped a shaking Clara to her feet. "Are you harmed, Miss Hayes?" I'm fine," she stammered, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Thank you." Just then, another car, a sleek, black Audi, pulled up. The back door opened, and Alistair Finch got out. He wasn't wearing his usual immaculate suit. He was in jeans and a dark Henley, and the look on his face was one of cold, unadulterated fury. He walked past the subdued attackers without a glance, his eyes fixed only on Clara. "Get in the car," he commanded, his voice tight with a tension that was more terrifying than his shouting had ever been. "What?" "My apartment." "Your apartment is no longer your home," he said, his jaw clenched. "You're not safe here. You're coming with me." He looked at Graves. "Get them to the private facility. Find out who sent them. I want a name by sunrise." Clara was too shocked to argue. She got into the car, and they sped away into the night, leaving the chaos behind. They didn't go to a hotel. They drove to a discreet, high-security building on the Gold Coast. The elevator opened directly into Alistair's penthouse, a sprawling, minimalist space of glass, steel, and concrete that felt more like a fortress than a home. He led her to a massive living area with a panoramic view of the dark, churning lake. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, neat, and handed one to her. Her hands were still trembling. "He tried to have you killed," Alistair said, his back to her as he stared out the window. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Clara whispered. "This is my fault," he said, turning to face her. The rage was gone, replaced by a raw, unsettling guilt. "I brought you into this. I put a target on your back. I walked into this with my eyes open," Clara countered, her voice gaining strength. "I made a deal." "This goes beyond a deal," he said, his blue eyes intense. "He crossed a line. Business is one thing. This is another. He made this personal." He paused, taking a step closer. "The annual Founders' Ball is tomorrow night. It's the biggest charity event in Chicago. The mayor, the governor, everyone will be there. Sterling is the guest of honor. He's receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the city." Clara scoffed. "A lifetime of crime, you mean?" "Exactly," Alistair said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I had planned to leak your findings to the SEC on Monday. But that's too clean, too impersonal. I think we should deliver the evidence in person." He looked at her. "I want you to come with me." "To a ball? Alistair, look at me. I'm a waitress who lives in a walk-up. I don't belong there." "You are the chief strategist of Helios Dynamics," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And you belong anywhere you damn well please. Tomorrow night, we're not just going to expose Richard Sterling. We're going to burn his entire world to the ground, right in front of his friends." The next evening, the grand ballroom of the Art Institute of Chicago was a glittering spectacle of old money and new power. Richard Sterling stood near the stage, accepting congratulations, the very picture of civic benevolence. He felt untouchable. His men had failed, but they hadn't talked. He would deal with the girl later, more permanently. Then, a hush fell over the room as the main doors opened. Alistair Finch entered, looking regal in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. But no one was looking at him. All eyes were on the woman on his arm. Clara wore a simple, devastatingly elegant gown of emerald green silk that clung to her form and left her shoulders bare. Her hair was styled in a sophisticated chignon, and around her neck was a single, breathtaking diamond on a platinum chain, a piece Alistair had insisted she wear from his mother's collection. She didn't look like an analyst or a strategist. She looked like royalty. She moved with a confidence that she didn't feel, channeling the strength of every woman in her family who had ever been told she wasn't good enough. Sterling's smile froze on his face. He watched, mesmerized with a mixture of lust and hatred as they glided through the crowd, which parted before them as if by magic. They stopped directly in front of him. "Richard," Alistair said, his voice dangerously pleasant. "Lovely party. Congratulations on the award." "Finch," Sterling grunted, his eyes flicking nervously to Clara. "I see you brought your new pet." Clara met his gaze without flinching. The fear she'd felt in the dark alley had been forged into cold, hard steel. "I'm not his pet, Richard," she said, her voice low and clear. "I'm the woman who read your secret ledger." Sterling's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Shell Corporation in Delaware," Clara continued, her voice a lethal whisper. "The kickbacks to your accounts in the Bahamas. The factory security chief who's been singing like a canary for the last 18 hours in a very quiet, very private room." "You have no proof," Sterling hissed, sweat beading on his upper lip. "We have the wire transfers," Alistair interjected smoothly, placing a protective hand on the small of Clara's back. "We have sworn testimony, and we have the 2 gentlemen you sent to assault Miss Hayes, who were more than happy to give you up in exchange for a reduced sentence." Sterling looked around wildly, his composure finally cracking. He saw the curious, watchful eyes of his peers. "Security," he bellowed. "Get them out of here." "That won't be necessary." A calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. The crowd shifted, and two men in dark suits, flanking a stern-faced woman, stepped forward. "Richard Sterling," the woman said, holding up a badge that identified her as an agent of the FBI's white-collar crime division. "You are under arrest for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder." The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers. Camera flashes began to strobe like lightning. Sterling, trapped and exposed, lost his mind. He lunged, not at Alistair, but at Clara. "You bitch! You ruined me!" he screamed, his hands reaching for her throat. Alistair moved with a speed that was shocking. He intercepted Sterling's lunge, spinning him around and slamming him against a marble column with a sickening thud. He pinned him there, his forearm pressed against Sterling's throat. "I told you!" Alistair snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl that cut through the noise. "She's with me. You put your hands on her, and prison will be the least of your worries." Federal agents swarmed forward, pulling a sputtering, defeated Sterling away. As they cuffed him and dragged him through the horrified crowd, the elite of Chicago looked from the fallen king to the two figures standing in the center of the storm. Later, on a deserted terrace overlooking the gardens, the cool night air was a relief. "It's over," Clara said, leaning against the balustrade, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade. "It's just beginning," Alistair said, coming to stand beside her. He took off his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm and smelled faintly of him. "My job is done then," she said, looking out at the city skyline. "I found the kill shot." Alistair turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "The job isn't done. Acquiring Sterling Manufacturing was the easy part. Rebuilding it, cleaning out the corruption, making it profitable and ethical. That's the real war. I need a general to lead that campaign." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "A general? The board has already approved it. I'm spinning it off as a new, independent subsidiary. It needs a president, a CEO." Clara stared at him, speechless. "Alistair, I don't have a degree. I don't have any experience running a company." "You have something more important," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate. "You have courage. You have a strategic mind unlike any I've ever seen. And you have integrity. I don't care about degrees. I care about character." He paused. "Take the job, Clara." She searched his eyes, looking for the ruthless billionaire, the impatient CEO. But she saw something else there, something vulnerable. "Is that the only reason you want me to stay?" she asked softly. The space between them crackled with unspoken energy. "No," he whispered. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. It wasn't a kiss of triumph or passion. It was a kiss of recognition, of two lonely, guarded people finding their equal. Clara melted into it, her hands coming up to cup his face, the cold diamond of the necklace pressing against her skin. For that one perfect moment, under the Chicago moon, they had won. But they had both forgotten a crucial lesson of history. A dying empire often has one last, poisoned arrow in its quiver. Richard Sterling, even in handcuffs, was still old money. And old money has allies who operate in the shadows. The next morning, the city was electrified by the news of Sterling's spectacular arrest. At the Helios Tower, Clara walked onto the executive floor, not as an outsider, but as a conqueror. The whispers that followed her now were of awe, not suspicion. Evelyn, the frosty assistant, even offered her a small, genuine smile. Clara sat at her desk, sipping her coffee, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her mother was safe. She had a future. she had Alistair. At 10:05 a.m., that peace was shattered. The glass doors to the floor burst open. "FBI! Everyone, hands on your desks! Don't touch your computers!" A team of a dozen agents swarmed the floor, their movements sharp and aggressive. The controlled hum of the office flatlined into stunned silence. Clara stood up, her heart leaping into her throat just as 3 agents converged on her office. "Clara Hayes," the lead agent, a grim-faced man with tired eyes, asked. "Yes?" she stammered. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit securities fraud and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act." The words were nonsensical, a language she didn't understand. "What? That's impossible. There's a mistake." "Turn around, ma'am. Hands behind your back," the agent said, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Alistair!" Clara cried out, her eyes darting toward his office. "Alistair, help me!" Alistair stormed out of his office, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief. "What in God's name is this? Who authorized this?" "Federal warrant, Mr. Finch. Step aside," the lead agent said, holding up a file. "We received an anonymous tip with authenticated documents from a whistleblower inside Sterling Manufacturing. It seems your new CEO wasn't just uncovering fraud, she was participating in it." The agent thrust a document into Alistair's hands. Wire transfers from the same offshore accounts Sterling was using, redirected to a new account in Zurich. An account opened 2 weeks ago, in the name of Clara Hayes' deceased father. It contains $10 million. Looks like a payoff from Sterling's criminal partners to keep their operation running after the takeover. Clara's world tilted on its axis. "No, that's a lie. It's a frame-up. Sterling did this." She looked at Alistair, her eyes pleading with him to see the truth, to fight for her. Alistair stared at the document. He saw the forged signatures, the fabricated transfer orders. It was a brilliant, vicious, and perfectly executed setup. Sterling's last arrow. For a long, agonizing moment, Alistair said nothing. He simply looked from the paper to Clara. And in that moment, his expression changed. The shock, the concern, the intimacy of the night before. It all vanished, replaced by an impenetrable mask of ice. The visionary was gone. The ruthless CEO of Helios Dynamics was back. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Alistair, no. You know it's not. You have to believe me." "The evidence is compelling," Alistair said, his voice carrying across the silent watching office. He handed the document back to the agent. He straightened his tie, his gaze sweeping over Clara as if she were a faulty piece of equipment. "My company has a zero-tolerance policy for illegal activity," he announced, his voice ringing with cold authority. "If Ms. Hayes has broken the law, she will face the consequences. Helios Dynamics will cooperate fully with the investigation. Remove her from the premises." The collective gasp from the employees was audible. Clara felt as if the floor had fallen away beneath her. "Alistair, please," she whispered, her voice breaking as the agent clamped the cold metal of the handcuffs onto her wrists. He wouldn't look at her. He turned his back, addressing the stunned onlookers. "Evelyn, her employment is terminated, effective immediately. Revoke all access. Erase her from the system." He then walked back into his office and shut the door, leaving her to be paraded through the company she was supposed to lead. The walk of shame to the elevator was the longest journey of her life. The eyes of her former colleagues were on her, a mixture of pity, fear, and morbid satisfaction. She was an outsider who had flown too high, and now they were all watching her fall. In the concrete holding cell, the smell of antiseptic and despair was overwhelming. Clara sat on a cold metal bench, the ghost of her emerald gown replaced by a wrinkled blouse and the crushing weight of betrayal. He hadn't just let them take her. He had condemned her. He had believed the lie, or worse, he had chosen his company over her. The numbers on a page had meant more than the woman he had kissed. Hours later, the cell door clanged open. A guard grunted, "Lawyer's here." "I can't afford a lawyer," she said numbly. "This one's paid for," the guard replied, pulling her to her feet. She was led to a small, windowless interrogation room. When the door opened, she braced herself for a court-appointed stranger. It was Alistair. The sight of him sent a surge of pure, white-hot rage through her. He looked haggard, his tie was loose, and he hadn't shaved. He quickly entered, shut the door, and placed a small electronic device on the table, activating it. A low hum filled the room. A signal jammer. Then he walked to the corner and physically unplugged the room's audio recording unit from the wall. "You have 10 seconds, Clara hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "Before I scream this place down, how dare you show your face to me?" "I had no choice," Alistair said, his voice low and urgent. "It was a performance. Clara, you have to listen to me. Sterling's allies planned this. It was a trap designed to take us both down." "A trap?" she spat. "You looked perfectly comfortable in your ivory tower while they were putting me in chains." "Think, Clara. Use that brain of yours," he pleaded, stepping closer. "If I had defended you, they would have named me as an accomplice. The board would have panicked. The stock would have crashed. They would have frozen my assets, seized the company. I would have been powerless. To save you, I had to be seen as your victim." He pulled a burner phone from his pocket and showed her a screen. It was an encrypted text exchange. Unknown. He bought it. "He thinks you threw the girl under the bus, Alistair. Does he have the proof?" Unknown. "The original server logs showing the frame-up. He's the IT director Sterling paid off. He's scared and wants out. He'll sell 5 million. Cash." Clara stared at the screen, her anger beginning to falter, replaced by a dizzying confusion. "I'm meeting him in an hour," Alistair said. "I'm going to buy the evidence that will clear your name. But for this to work, everyone has to believe I hate you. The FBI, Sterling's people. Everyone." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate pain. "I had to let them take you. I had to break your heart in public to save you in private. And it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do." He took her cuffed hands in his. "The guards are about to come back. They're listening. We have to finish the performance. I need you to fight me. I need you to scream at me. Make them believe it's real." Understanding dawned. She looked into his eyes and saw not betrayal, but a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. She nodded slowly. She took a deep breath, summoning all the pain and humiliation she felt. She ripped her hands from his grasp. "You coward!" she shrieked, the sound raw and piercing. "You left me to rot. I gave you everything, and you threw me away like trash." Alistair backed away, his own voice rising. "You were a mistake, a liability I never should have taken on." "I hope your company burns to the ground," Clara screamed, kicking the metal table. It crashed against the wall with a deafening clang. "Get out! I never want to see your face again." Alistair slammed his fist on the door. "Guard, get me out of here. The woman is hysterical." The door flew open. A guard rushed in. Alistair, his face a perfect mask of fury and disgust, stormed out without a backward glance. But as he passed through the doorway, just out of the guard's line of sight, he let his hand drop to his side and tapped his thumb against his index finger. Twice. It was the Morse code signal for the letter T. Trust. The door slammed shut, plunging Clara back into silence. But this time she wasn't broken. She sat down on the bench, took a steadying breath, and began to plan her next move. The game wasn't over. It had just entered its most dangerous phase. For 2 days, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation. She ate the tasteless food, slept on the hard cot, and spoke to no one. She held on to that single Morse code signal like a prayer. But with each passing hour, a sliver of doubt crept in. What if the deal went wrong? What if Alistair was playing an even deeper game, one where she was truly disposable? On the third morning, the cell door opened. It wasn't a guard. It was the lead FBI agent, the one who had arrested her. His face was grim, and he didn't meet her eyes. "Ms. Hayes," he said stiffly. "You're being released. An anonymous source delivered a hard drive to our office early this morning. It contained the unredacted server logs from Sterling's network, along with a sworn, videotaped confession from his head of IT. The evidence against you was fabricated. All charges are being dropped." Clara felt a wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees. She walked out of the precinct into the grey morning light. A free woman. A black Audi was waiting at the curb. The back door swung open. She got in. Alistair was there. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. "What about the IT director?" she asked. "He's on a private jet to a country with no extradition treaty, $5 million richer." He held up his end of the bargain. Alistair leaned his head back, the exhaustion evident on his face. "I'm so sorry, Clara. For all of it. You did what you had to do," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You kept your promise." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the cost of his gamble. "So what now?" "Now?" he said, a faint smile returning to his lips. "We go to work." The resolution wasn't a triumphant press conference or a celebratory dinner. It was a slow, grueling war fought in boardrooms and on factory floors. Alistair didn't just hand Clara the title of CEO. Instead, he made her the head of the Sterling Transition Task Force. Her first act was not to sit in a corner office, but to fly to the beleaguered factory south of the city. She walked onto the factory floor not in a designer suit, but in steel-toed boots and a hard hat. She met with the union bosses, the shift supervisors and the line workers, the very people Sterling had betrayed. She didn't make grand promises. She showed them the evidence of his theft. She showed them how he had been stealing from their pensions and their profit sharing. She laid out her plan not as a corporate takeover, but as a salvage operation. For weeks, she worked alongside them, learning the machinery, identifying the real inefficiencies, and earning their trust, one conversation at a time. She fired the corrupt managers loyal to Sterling and promoted talented, overlooked supervisors from within. She fought Alistair's bored tooth and nail to reinvest profits into better equipment and safer working conditions, instead of just stripping the company for assets. Alistair watched from a distance, giving her the autonomy she needed. He saw her winning over the hearts and minds of a workforce that had been taught to despise corporate suits. He saw her turning a failing, corrupt enterprise into something lean, honest, and productive. 2 months later, Alistair called an emergency board meeting for the new subsidiary, Sterling Helios Industries. Clara entered the boardroom in a sharp navy suit, her face calm and confident. The old Sterling loyalists on the board looked at her with open hostility. "The transition is complete," Alistair announced. "The company is stabilized, and for the first time in 5 years, it is projected to be profitable by the next quarter. All thanks to the tireless work of Ms. Hayes." He paused, looking around the table. "However, the board requires permanent leadership. We will now vote for the new chief executive officer." One of the Sterling loyalists, a bulldog of a man named Henderson, spoke up. "With all due respect, Finch, The girl has done a fine job with the workers, but she's not a CEO. She has no experience, no MBA. She has something better, a new voice said from the back of the room. A grizzled man in a worn work jacket stood up. It was the union president from the factory, a man who had initially been Clara's fiercest opponent. She has our respect. For the first time in 20 years, we trust the person in charge. If she's not the CEO, you can count on a general strike starting tomorrow morning. One by one, the other plant supervisors and employee representatives in the room stood up in silent solidarity. Henderson and the other old guard members stared, aghast. They had been outmaneuvered. Clara had not fought the battle in the boardroom. She had won it on the ground. The vote was unanimous. That night, they weren't in a fancy restaurant or a penthouse. They were in Clara's new, modest apartment, which she had insisted on paying for herself. They were eating take-out pizza from a box balanced on the coffee table. CEO Hayes, Alistair said, a look of profound admiration in his eyes. It has a nice ring to it. It does, Clara agreed, taking a bite of pizza. She looked at him, her expression serious. We need to set some ground rules for this partnership. I'm listening, he said. Rule 1, she said, holding up a finger. You will never again make a decision that affects my life or my liberty, no matter how well-intentioned, without telling me first. We are partners. That means we face the fire together. Agreed, he said without hesitation. Rule 2. My company, my decisions. You can advise, you can argue, but you do not overrule me. Agreed. And Rule 3, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips as she leaned in, echoing their first real conversation. If you ever, for any reason, shout at me like you did in that restaurant. Alistair smiled, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his face. He leaned in and captured her lips in a kiss that was no longer about desperation or recognition, but about a shared future. He pulled back just enough to whisper, This is over? No, Clara whispered back, her hazel eyes gleaming with the fire he now knew so well. Then I buy your company, and you'll be working for me. Alistair Finch threw his head back and laughed, a loud, genuine sound of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found his match. The waitress from Chicago had not just won the battle, she had redrawn the entire map.